Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. My name is Amar Ahmed. I'm a solicitor, criminal lawyer, deal with terrorist cases. I work for, you may have heard of Imran Khan and Partners. We were previously Christian Khan and Partners. We have dealt with a lot of these kind of cases. What I'd like to do tonight is give you an overview as to what your rights are if the police come knocking at your door. Saghir will go on to explain more about the legislation and how it works, and then of course we'll have a Q&A session which I think will be most informative for you, because then you can ask us directly questions. So, what happens if the police come knocking at your door? No doubt a lot of fear and confusion is caused. If they are police from the counter-terrorism squad, they have a particular format and how they do these raids, and it is quite heavy-handed. Invariably, if people are being arrested on suspicion of some form of terrorist offence, and let's talk about terrorist offences, they are very wide-ranging, and so supporting groups, making comments, and if you've read this the pamphlet, you'll know that the brother who was recently arrested, essentially, we're being told that it's because he tweeted something to his friends, "Oi lads, I smell war." I'm sure there's more to it than that, but if that's the key to it, then clearly anything you say can potentially get you arrested. So, if the police attend your address, as I've said, usually their approach will be it will be very heavy-handed. The reason being, from their point of view, is that if they're arresting people who are suspected of terrorist offences, they don't know what to expect. And it's a policy decision. Of course, the effects of a heavy-handed raid are frightening for the individual and their family, the women in the house, the children. They're all very upset. That again is part of, in my view, a strategy to make sure that people know how serious the police supposedly are taking it. But it causes, of course... Sorry, is that better? Can you hear me now? So I beg your pardon. So, as I was saying, the strategy is to cause confusion and fear. You may remember the case of Amar Ahmed, who unfortunately now in a supermax prison in the United States. His raid was, when he was raided, he was treated to some quite appalling behaviour, and police officers were actually prosecuted and acquitted of what they had done to him, despite the fact that they'd actually settled out of court. The Metropolitan Police had settled out of court for the behaviour of the officers, but in terms of their criminal culpability, they were found not guilty. So that obviously created alarm amongst the Muslims in the Muslim community. Now, going back to if you're raided, as I said, it's likely to be a very frightening experience. The practical advice that I'd like to give tonight is what people should do. Because from my point of view, if I explain the law to brothers and sisters here, I'm not sure that it's the necessary thing. It really is practical advice. So God forbid you're at home this evening and the police come knocking on your door. They're not going to be knocking politely. They may smash the door down and loads of officers come running in, either armed, certainly in boiler suits, helmets and all sorts of things, clearly very frightening. The best advice I can give to people is, as best they can, is to remain calm. That may sound a little obvious and very difficult to do, but that is the best advice. They should have access to a lawyer's number, because the reality of it is, when the police raid, there's not much that you can say or do. You can question them, particularly when you're dealing with counter-terrorism officers. They're not going to say anything. They're going to essentially arrest you, tell you, give you perhaps a caution, and then you're going to be carted off to the police station. So the people who are left behind, family, wives, daughters, children, they are very upset. I do think there's a need for the community to be able to support people who have been arrested, and their families especially, because if the person who's been arrested is taken to the police station, he in effect is out of the situation. It's his family who are frightened, confused. Then other members of the community get involved, and in my experience, there's a big hullabaloo as to what to do. The key thing has to be know your rights, and your rights on arrest. You'll be arrested for whatever the offence is. You will be cautioned and told that you, I won't go through the caution, but essentially that you have the right to remain silent, but it can harm your defence if you don't say something when questioned. There's nothing to say at that point. If you're being arrested, there's nothing to say, and in actual fact, the best option is to actually, this may sound counterintuitive, but actually to cooperate. Cooperate in the sense that don't put yourself in a position of danger, because that applies to you and potentially your family. So my advice would always be, and it is always to clients, is not to antagonise the situation, because you're in a no-win situation. Officers and potentially are waiting for a reaction, because then there could be further offences. So the best option is to comply at that point with what police officers are doing. You should appreciate that they have control over you. It may be in your house, it may be in the street, it may be you coming off a plane or a boat as you come back into the country. The best thing to do is just to comply with what they're doing. You have the right to a lawyer, and the most important thing is that either when you get to the police station, or more practically, your family should have access to a lawyer, names and numbers who can be contacted. And I would say that it's essential for people in the community to have those names and numbers, because if there is a fear that that's going to happen, the first person you must call is your lawyer, because it's your lawyer who can come to the police station, contact the officers and find out what's going on. The ball starts rolling. Then you have somebody who's observing what is happening to you. Even if they're not at the police station, they have that. The police will know that there is a lawyer involved. So that's the most practical piece of advice in terms of what happens when the police attend your address. When you get to the police station, again, and I've been in police stations when people have been brought in, and they're either, if they are struggling, fighting, resisting the police, they can be actually committing offences. As much as we know that may not be an offence, if you strike a police officer, push a police officer, assault, resisting with the intent to resist arrest, and that will be added on. In actual fact, that may be the only thing that you're ever charged with. That often happens as well. People get arrested for more serious offences, terrorist offences, but in actual fact they get charged for something very minor under the ordinary criminal law. So it is about being conscious of what's happening to you. It's easy for, I appreciate, you may think, well, Amar, it's easy for you to say these things, but if you're involved, if it were you, what would you do? I would hope that that's what I would do, but then of course I'm a lawyer, and that's the best advice I can give to people when they're being arrested. When you get to the police station, of course, what will happen is that you'll be booked in front of the custody sergeant. And the custody sergeant has to authorise your detention. There is a process, and so the police have to justify why you were at the police station. And of course it's usually a simple exercise where an officer will say, this person's been arrested under section whatever it is of the Terrorism Act, and he has to be detained for a prompt and effective investigation. The custody sergeant will be satisfied with that, and then they'll go through your rights. Again, the most important thing is, I want a lawyer. Without a lawyer, the police then are not being held accountable to what's going on at the police station. So once you're processed, of course, then there's the photographing, fingerprinting, taking of DNA, and people ask, well, do I have to give these things over? Do I have a right to object? The reality is you don't. The law is very clear on this. If you're arrested, the police have the right to take your fingerprints, your photograph, and your DNA. Again, resisting that, as people do, they say, I'm not going to give my fingerprints. And they resist with officers. And again, they get charged with resisting an officer in the execution of his lawful duty. Again, I would say you have to comply with that. My message isn't about complying with everything that the police are asking you to do. There is a time when you shouldn't be just complying with what they are asking you to do. That usually is in the interview, because that is the most important thing that will happen to you at a police station in terms of the process. So once you've been fingerprinted, photographed, DNA'd, and you've complied with all of that, unfortunately, you'll be placed in a cell. Now, if you're arrested under terrorism legislation, police can hold you for 14 days. That's the current limit. It was 28, came down to 14. That's a long time. How many people spend 14 days in the police station under Terrorism Act? I think the statistics show there aren't that many who spend that amount of time. But any amount of time in a police station in a cell is traumatic. You're isolated, you're worried about yourself and your family, and confused. Another reason to have somebody else who can overview what is happening to you, and that is your lawyer. So once the police have decided that they're ready to interview you, your lawyer will be called down to the police station, given some disclosure. And the way that disclosure works in terrorism cases is it's very limited. The police will invariably give you a sheet, or your lawyer, a sheet of paper explaining the basics of why they say they've arrested you and why they suspect that you're involved in criminal offences, or terrorist offences. Your lawyer will have a consultation with you, and that can be for as long as you need. But invariably, your lawyer in terrorism cases will advise you to make no comment to questions. Now, there are very good reasons for that, because disclosure to lawyers in a police station is phased with terrorism cases. In practical terms, the police will turn up with a folder, have a sheet of paper, give the folder to the lawyer, so take the folder, speak to your client in private. It's a private consultation. Whether people are listening to you, I can't vouch that they're not. But the reality of it is that is your opportunity to speak to your lawyer. And I have my suspicions, of course, but we are told that these are private consultations. So whatever information, if somebody was listening to your consultation, they couldn't actually use it as evidence. Now, once you've spoken to your lawyer, and if your advice is to make no comment, then my strong advice is to follow that. The reasons to make no comment at that stage is because invariably terrorism cases involve a lot of evidence. Much of it hasn't even been gathered. So once you start commenting on the piece of paper that they've given to you, that interview finishes. Police reassess what you've said, and then will provide the lawyer with a second piece of disclosure, and you'll have a second interview, and they will try and add to what you have said and what they've asked you. And that can carry on for 3 or 4 or as many interviews as they see fit. So you can then begin to see, well, actually, if I'm saying this piece here, and then another piece here, and a little bit more there, that actually they're able to build up a case against me, perhaps, or they're getting information which they can use to perhaps prosecute you. So that is why lawyers will invariably advise you in these kind of cases to make no comment, and as I said, once again, say that's my strong advice. Now, you can be at a police station for a long time. Your rights to speak to your family are limited. Of course, you have, of course, the right to communicate with people outside, and invariably that does mean family. But the police can withhold that right as well, and invariably with terrorism cases, that's exactly what they do. So you are secluded, alone, in the police station, and the only person you can really rely upon is your lawyer. I don't want this to sound like I can hear myself saying lawyer, 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 as if there's somebody who's going to gift you out of the police station. They're not going to be able to do that. But what they can do is make sure that in terms of the legal process, things are going right and that you are not making mistakes. You may or may not be guilty of something, but if you say the wrong thing, like the brother here perhaps has said the wrong thing at some point, you'll get yourself arrested and possibly prosecuted. So once the interviews are underway, and let's say they're completed in a day or two's time, the police have to make a decision as to what they're going to do, whether they're going to charge you, bail you to return, which means release you from the police station with a date to come back to the police station while they make further inquiries, which is often what happens, or they'll charge you with a terrorism offence. If you're bailed to return, that's where the real danger, in my opinion, lies, because you've had your interview, been released from the police station, you think, well, okay, they're investigating things. The truth of it is, even in ordinary criminal offences, but particularly in offences where terrorism is alleged, the police will be monitoring everything you say and do. Not just you, the people you know and the people you contact. And of course, there's been a natural tendency for people to say, well, tell me what happened. What was this about? Give me this information. Give me that information. The best advice I can give you is you do not discuss anything with anyone. If you need to discuss what's happened at the police station, what the evidence is, speak to your lawyer. It really is important. And this is something I'd like to stress because, coming from the communities that we come from, we know that it could be mother, father, they want to know, and there's a pressure to tell them. The information that you give out, even to your parents innocently or any relative, can invariably find its way to somebody else and then back to a police officer who's investigating you. So my strong advice is to be very conscious of that fact and to say nothing. Now, if you were charged with an offence, what is going to happen to you then? Well, if the police decide they have sufficient evidence to charge you, you will end up invariably in court the next day. You do have the right to apply for bail at the police station, but usually once you've been charged with a terrorism offence, you can bet your bottom dollar that as night follows day, you're going to be in the police station in court the next day. Terrorism offences invariably go straight to the Crown Court, and then you're part of the process. If you're refused bail at court, which is, it depends on the circumstances, so I don't want to generalise, because you can, of course, get bail. But if you refuse bail, then you will end up in custody. Again, if you end up in custody, the same point that I made earlier about who you speak to and what you say is vitally important, because, again, the opportunities for the police to gather evidence whilst you've been charged and are in custody, or even if you're on bail, the opportunities are there for them. And the thing I can't stress highly enough is to be conscious of that fact. The police are always gathering evidence and always will be, particularly in terrorism cases. So we need to be very conscious that of who we speak to and what we say. Now, of course, I won't go on into what happens in terms of the trial and things, because that's not really the purpose of this, of my speaking to you today. Essentially, it is about what happens. And the real key for me is to know that you have to be conscious of what's happening to you and where you are in the system. I always find that the clients who have a sense of what's going on are best able to listen to your advice and put themselves in the best position that they can. You won't know what the evidence is until much later. But if you make mistakes in the police station, it can be and they are crucial to your trial, because most of it will happen there. The lawyers will then have to try and work back from what you've said in the trial, in police stations, and what comments you've made in an interview if you have not listened to the advice. And that can be fatal to your chances of success. So that, in a nutshell, is what happens if you're arrested. In terms of the wider family, the community, of course, I think support networks are essential, particularly particularly for the Muslim community, because we know that the terrorism legislation is by and large being used against the Muslim community. Saghir may go on to this, but I mean, we were discussing this before we started our talk tonight, that the vast majority of people who are arrested under the Terrorism Act are released without charge. One of the other, so that's something to be very conscious of, that if there is a raid, lots of people are captured by it and then invariably thrown out bit by bit by bit. And if they are charged with something, it will be something like the resisting arrest or assaulting a police officer whilst you were being arrested, no doubt heavy-handedly. We can go into the details of if there's a Q&A as to what actually you can do if a police officer is manhandling you or members of your family. It's limited, but you do have a right to, in theory, self-defence. And we can go into that in due course in the Q&As. But So for me, the buzzword really is about being conscious of what's happening to you. And as I say, the wider community I think we do have to form, through Cage and others, support networks, because what's happening, what I observe happening in the Muslim community is wide-scale fear. Somebody's been arrested, he must have been up to something, he must have done something wrong, otherwise the police wouldn't have got involved. Invariably, that's not true. As we've seen, many, many people get arrested and many, many people get released without any charge at all. It's a small number that are ever charged. So clearly fear is being either deliberately, you may argue, or inadvertently being spread through the community. And for me as a Muslim, as a Pakistani, I would say the concern is how do we react to that? Because obviously getting arrested and going through the process, it is part of a process and it will take its course. But it's how the community deal with that, which I think is really, really key to how these things, how we deal with people being arrested, not just for terrorism offences, for any offence, because essentially what you will find is wide-scale panic. That in itself often triggers more tension in the community, more tension in the family, and doesn't help the person who has actually been arrested. At this stage, there's nothing more that I want to add to that part of it. So if there are Q&As later, I'm more than happy to answer any questions.